In 1935, a work crew was cutting a trail through a cave in Kentucky, 2 miles inside. Ordinary work. One of them climbed onto a ledge above the passage floor. There was a boulder up there. He looked under the edge of it. There was a hand, then an arm. Then, as the lamp came round, a face. There was a man under the rock, not a skeleton, a man. Dried, darkened, shrunken by the air, but whole, skin, hair, preserved by 2 miles of unchanging dry cave, exactly where he fell. Their first thought was that he got lost. He didn't. No boots, no buttons, no lamp. Nothing from the last 100 years. He was wearing a woven robe, a shell pendant at his throat, sandals braided from plant fiber, and beside his free hand, still lying where he set it down, a mussel shell, worn smooth along one edge. A tool. He was not lost. He was working. He was 2 miles underground because that was where his work was, and the rock came down while he was doing it. Then the dating came back. 2,400 years. He was already ancient when Rome was still a small town, and nobody had moved that rock. Not once. Not in 80 generations. But he isn't the story. He's just the first thing anybody happened to notice. Because once archaeologists started properly looking at what was inside that cave system, what they found sat so far outside what anyone expected that most people, even now, have never heard a word about it. Here is what is down there. 19 miles of passage, explored on foot, by hand, not near the entrance, deep. In places, 5 miles from the nearest daylight. Artifacts scattered as far as 12 miles in, woven sandals, gourd bowls, cane baskets, wooden climbing poles, burnt torch stubs in their thousands. Mineral workings running through 16 miles of the system, drawings scratched into walls with soot, and bodies. In those dry passages nothing rots, so none of it was ever buried. It is all lying exactly where it was dropped. This is the Mammoth Cave system in Kentucky, the longest cave on Earth. More than 400 miles of it mapped, and they are still finding more every year. And on the evidence we have, what Native Americans did inside it is the deepest ancient cave exploration known anywhere in the world. Not Europe, not Asia, Kentucky. Archaeologists who have spent entire careers down there call these people the greatest cave explorers who have ever lived. And almost nobody has heard of them. And here's what keeps me up at night. This was not one expedition. It was not a bad season or a desperate year. The dates run for 800 years. 8 centuries of people walking into that hill, seasonally, on schedule, generation after generation. Their grandparents did it. Their grandchildren did it. They went in during late spring and again in late autumn, like a harvest. And in all that time, they never wrote a single thing down. No maps, no writing, no survey, no compass, no marks anyone can read as a route. 19 miles of 3-dimensional labyrinth, held entirely inside human memory, passed on by voice, by taking somebody with you and showing them, and all of it done by torchlight. Bundles of dried river cane, cut on the bank above. A bundle burns for about 45 minutes, then it goes out. That is the whole technology standing between a human being and absolute darkness, 5 miles inside a hill. They brought children. There is a boy from these caves, around 9 years old, who died down there while working, and they were not starving. Their diet is preserved in detail, and it is the diet of farmers with full storerooms. Hickory nuts, sunflower, squash, goosefoot and maygrass, crops they planted on purpose. These were not desperate people taking the only job available. They had food, they had options, they had somewhere else to be, and they went in anyway. But here's the real question, the one that actually matters. Why? Why go in at all? Why go 12 miles when the first mile would have done? Why bring a 9-year-old with you? Why do it on a schedule, in the same 2 seasons, every year, for 800 years? Why keep going back to a place that had already killed people you knew? What is worth carrying fire into the dark for 8 centuries? The standard answer is mining. They were taking minerals off the walls: gypsum, mirabilite, epsomite, soft white sulfate crusts that grow on limestone deep inside a cave, where nothing ever floods and nothing ever dries out. Some of it makes a good white pigment, some of it is genuine medicine, and it works, and we still use versions of the same compounds today. So it is a mine, a pharmacy, a trade good moving through a network. Case closed. But here's what bothers me. That mineral does not only grow 12 miles in, it grows in the first mile. It grows in passages you could walk to, work, and leave again inside an afternoon. Same substance, same wall, same crust. If this is a business, then every mile past the nearest working face is pure loss. Wasted fuel, wasted time, wasted lives. No mining operation in history has ever behaved like that, because no mining operation could survive behaving like that. You do not walk 12 miles into a hill for something sitting by the door. Not once, not seasonally, not for 800 years, with your children beside you, past the place where the last man died. That is not work, that is a pilgrimage with a shell scraper in its hand. Whatever these people were doing down there, the distance was never a cost they were paying. The distance was the point, and the deeper they went, the more it counted. And it was not one cave. The ridge above the Green River is riddled with them. Salts, crystal, colossal, unknown. Mammoth itself. Modern cavers spent decades proving they were all one connected system, and only joined the last of them in 1972. But those people were working several of the mouths at once, thousands of years earlier, treating an entire ridge of hills as a single place. This was not a site. This was a region with something underneath it. And then it stops. Around 200 BC, after 8 unbroken centuries, they walked out and never went back. No collapse, no flood. The gypsum still on the walls, the roots still open, the cane still growing on the riverbank. They simply stopped. And they left fresh bundles stacked against the wall for a trip that never happened. So the question isn't only what they were doing down there, it's what changed so completely that nobody ever went down again. Walk those passages today, and the floor is covered in things, not artifacts in cases. Litter, a sandal, dropped and left, a gourd bowl on its side, a mussel shell worn down along one edge, finished with, thrown away, cane baskets, wooden poles, burnt torch ends everywhere in their thousands. Nothing rots in that dry air, so nothing has ever been buried or cleared. This is not an archaeological layer. This is a workplace that everybody walked out of and nobody ever tidied. And it goes on for miles. Not a scatter near the entrance. Miles. The debris tracks the roots, deeper and deeper into the hill, past the point where any daylight has ever reached, past the point where most people alive today would turn around. Thousands upon thousands of ordinary objects, all of them dropped by somebody, all of them exactly where they landed. You are not looking at a site, you are looking at 800 years of people's discarded working days. And then there are the caches. In places along the route, bundles of fresh cane are stacked neatly against the wall, unused, unburnt, set down carefully, ready. Somebody staged those for the next trip in. Somebody expected to be back inside a few days to pick them up. And here's what keeps me up at night. Nobody ever did. They have been sitting there in the dark for 2,000 years, waiting for a morning that never came. The dates come from soot, charred wood, cane, fabric, and preserved human waste. 57 separate determinations from these 2 caves, and they cluster. There is an early group going back 4,700 years when people were exploring, then the serious phase. From around 1000 BC to around 200 BC, the visits become systematic, organized, repetitive. 800 years of it, and then nothing. 8 centuries. Put that in a frame you can actually feel. 800 years is 4 times longer than the United States has existed. It is longer than the gap between us and the Black Death. From the first organized trip into that hill to the very last one, more time passed than separates you from the Crusades. And across all of it, the same routes, the same walls, the same work. Now, the obvious objection, maybe that is an illusion. Maybe there was one great burst of activity, and the dates just smear across centuries because dating is imprecise. It is a fair thought. It is also wrong. The determinations are spread evenly through the whole span. Early, middle, late. There is no single spike. This was not an event that got stretched by the maths. It was continuous, and it was maintained. Then look at how far they went. 19 miles of passage explored inside what is now the park. In places 5 miles from the nearest daylight. Artifacts found as far as 12 miles in. 12 miles, on foot, in the dark. Much of it bent double or on your hands and knees. And every one of those miles has to be walked twice, because whatever you carry in, you carry back out. And whatever light you burn getting there is light you no longer have. Second objection, and it is the better one. Maybe they crept further in gradually, century by century, a little deeper each generation, the way any exploration works. Except the deep material is not all late. People were reaching serious depth early in the sequence. They were not inching. Somebody, quite early on, decided that going a very long way inside a hill in total darkness was a reasonable thing to do, and then everybody after them agreed. And it was never just one cave. Salts, crystal, colossal, unknown, Mammoth itself. Several separate mouths in the same ridge above the Green River, all worked, all at the same time. Modern cavers spent decades proving these were one connected system, and only joined the last of them in 1972. 3,000 years earlier, people were already treating the whole ridge as a single place of work. All of it done by torchlight. River cane, cut from the bank above the entrances, dried and bound into bundles about the thickness of your wrist. Light one end. That is the entire technology. And the spent stubs are everywhere along the routes, dropped where they burned out, thousands and thousands of them, because a bundle only lasts about 45 minutes. Somebody down there was constantly, endlessly feeding the dark. Here is the least dignified evidence, and the most useful. Preserved human waste, dried intact after 2,000 years. Dozens of specimens. Analysis gives the diet almost meal by meal. Hickory nuts, sunflower, goosefoot, maygrass, squash and gourd. No maize, which places these people before corn ever reached them. But the important part is far simpler than the menu. They were eating down there, which means they were staying down there. And they went on a schedule. Pollen recovered from those same deposits clusters in 2 windows. Late spring into early summer, then late autumn into winter. Twice a year, the same 2 seasons, for 800 years. That is not panic. That is not refuge. Nobody flees into a hill on a calendar. This was a season, like a harvest, and every generation kept it. They also drew. Along the routes there are marks on the walls, made partly with the charred tips of the torches they were already holding. Not animals. Not people. Geometric. Cross-hatching. Ruled lines. Spirals. Made in passing. In the dark. By somebody with a burnt reed in one hand, and miles still left to walk. Nobody knows what they meant. But you do not decorate a place you are only passing through. And here's what should be impossible. No maps, no writing, no survey, no compass, no marker system anyone has been able to read. 19 miles of 3-dimensional labyrinth, in a system so complicated that modern surveyors with instruments are still finding new passage every year, held entirely inside human memory, handed down by voice. Turn left where the ceiling drops. Do not take the low passage after the sound of water. Take a moment here, because we are about to go somewhere darker. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, and what time it is where you are. It is honestly the best part of doing this. Right now it is 2 in the morning in Los Angeles, 5 in New York, 10 in the morning in London, late morning in Lagos, the middle of the afternoon in Delhi, and in Sydney it is already dark again. Some of you are falling asleep. Some of you are only just starting your day. Nobody is down here on their own, which, given where this story is going, feels about right. Subscribe if you would like more of these, and a like helps somebody else find one on a bad night. Anyway, back to the torches. Everything runs through one object. Not the minerals, not the tools, the torch. A bundle of dried cane, cut on a riverbank, bound at one end, lit at the other. That is all of it. No lamp, no oil, no fat, no wick, no spare. People usually say the distance is the astonishing part. It isn't. The astonishing part is that they covered 12 miles of it holding a burning stick that was already dying in their hand. River cane grows in thick stands along the Green River, right above the cave mouths. It is a native bamboo, tall, hollow, and once it dries it burns fast and hot. Cut it, season it, bind several lengths together, set one end alight. No moving parts, no fuel tank, nothing to adjust or refill. It is the simplest possible answer to darkness, and it was the only answer anybody in that valley had. Here is the number that reorganizes everything. About 45 minutes. That is what a 3-foot bundle gives you. Experiments with similar torches put the average around 40 minutes, sometimes as little as 20, sometimes an hour. Then the flame is gone, and you are standing inside a hill holding a warm black stick. 45 minutes. That is the unit of time down there. Not hours, not days, bundles. So do the arithmetic they had to do. 3 miles in is not a 3-mile walk. Cave miles are not surface miles. Crawls, climbs, breakdown, slow footing on ground you can barely see. Call it hours in, hours back. And every 45 minutes of all of that, your light dies and has to be replaced. One deep trip does not need 1 torch, or 5. It needs dozens. For a working party, many dozens. Now try to carry them. Cane is light on its own and enormously bulky in quantity. 40 bundles is an armful you cannot get through a crawl. And you are also carrying tools, containers, food, water, and whatever you intend to bring out. No rucksack, no wheel, no cart, and long stretches of the route need you on your hands and knees. The problem is not strength. The problem is geometry. You cannot physically bring in the light you need. So they solved it another way, and this is the most impressive thing in the entire story. They provisioned the route. Fresh cane was carried in ahead of time and stockpiled at intervals along the passages, staged like fuel depots. You burn what you brought to reach the first cache. Resupply, walk on, push forward into the dark while continually laying down, behind you, the light you will need to get home. And here's what that actually requires of a person. You have to know the burn rate of your own torches. You have to know how long each leg takes. You have to calculate the return before you set out, because the return is not optional. And you have to trust, completely, that the cache 4 miles behind you is still there, still dry, still enough. One error, anywhere in that chain, and nobody comes home. They ran that system for 800 years. The torch itself does not cooperate. Modern researchers found this out the hard way trying to reproduce them. Cane torches burn unevenly. They dim, gutter, and threaten to die for no reason. They demand constant attention, and the way you revive one is to swing it hard through the air to feed it oxygen. So picture that. walking a passage whose end you cannot see, stopping every few minutes to whip your only light source back and forth to keep it alive. And they smoke, heavily. That is the single most consistent complaint in every study of ancient torchlight. In a big chamber, the smoke lifts and disperses. In a low passage it does not. It fills the space you are in, at head height, exactly where your eyes are. So you are moving through a tube of rock, breathing the smoke of the thing showing you the rock, coughing, eyes streaming, unable to stop watching where your feet land. Then there is what you can actually see. A good torch throws usable light maybe 15 or 20 feet. That sounds fine until you are standing in a chamber 100 feet across. Then it does not show you the room at all. It shows you a circle of floor, a curve of wall, and past that a wall of black that moves when you move. You never see the space you are in, only the part you are standing in. Stay with that, because it is the lived experience. You are inside a small travelling bubble of orange light. It moves when you move. Nothing outside it exists. The passage ahead does not exist until you arrive in it. The passage behind stops existing the moment you leave. For hours at a stretch, the entire universe is a sphere about 40 feet wide with you at the centre, and it is made of fire, and the fire is running out. Now put yourself in the body. Woven fibre sandals, or nothing. Cave floors are wet, cold and uneven. Researchers who have walked caves barefoot with a torch, deliberately, to understand this, report the same two things. The cold comes up through you immediately, and if anything went wrong, you could not run. Not holding a flame you have to protect. Over ground you cannot see, where falling does not only hurt you, it costs you your light. Because that is the real fear, and everyone who has been down there knows it. Not darkness in the ordinary sense, cave darkness. There is no adjustment period, no faint outline resolving after a minute. Your eyes are simply switched off, and people in that state consistently report the same thing. The mind refuses the emptiness and starts supplying its own images, shapes, movement, light that is not there, and you still have miles of memorized turnings left to make. The obvious objection is that surely they had something better. Surely somewhere down there is a lamp, a stone bowl, a wick, some rendered fat, something. And here's what bothers me. There isn't. Thousands of artifacts recovered from those passages, and the lighting technology is cane. That is it. For 800 years, in the deepest cave exploration known anywhere on Earth, nobody ever improved on a burning reed. And all that fire left a record. Every torch pressed to a wall, every bundle knocked against a low ceiling, left soot behind. One great chamber has a ceiling blackened by thousands of years of accumulated smoke. Soot is carbon, and carbon can be dated. We know when those people walked those passages because of the smoke from the light they were carrying. Which brings us to what they were burning it for, because we know exactly what they scraped off those walls. And that is where this stops making sense. Bring a light into the dry upper passages, and the walls are not grey. They are white. In places they look iced, crusts of pale crystal spreading across the limestone in sheets, glittering wherever the flame touches them. Frost that never melts, that is what they came for. Not stone, not ore. Nothing you could strike into a blade or a point. A soft mineral bloom, growing quietly on the walls of a hole in the ground. It forms the way salt forms on skin. The rock above is not truly dry. Moisture creeps through the pores of the limestone, carrying dissolved minerals, and when it reaches open air in the passage, it evaporates. What it was carrying stays behind. Grain by grain, over thousands of years, the wall grows a skin of crystal. It needs stillness. It needs dryness. It only happens deep inside, where weather never reaches, which is precisely where these people went. And it does not grow flat. Depending on the shape of the pore it is pushed through, it takes extraordinary forms. sugary crust that sparkles like fresh fallen snow. Curling petals archaeologists simply call gypsum flowers, snowballs, needles, strands fine as hair, whole walls of pale blossoms opening in total darkness, in a place where nothing has ever seen daylight. Nobody laid eyes on any of it for 10,000 years. Then somebody walked in holding a burning reed. They have names now: gypsum, which is calcium sulfate, the common one, selenite and satin spar, the clear and silky forms of the same mineral, mirabilite, sodium sulfate, epsomite, magnesium sulfate, which you may know as Epsom salt, all sulfates, all soft, all soluble in water. And every one of them was scraped off those walls deliberately by people who could tell them apart and knew which ones they wanted. The tools were simple, and most are still lying there. Freshwater mussel shells from the Green River, carried in, used as scrapers and spoons. Lumps of limestone used as hammerstones. Where the crust was thin, they scraped it. Where it was thick, or set into a ledge, they battered it loose. The marks are still on the rock. Thousands of small strikes and scrapes, all by hand, all by torchlight, all made by somebody standing exactly where you would be standing. And this was not one corner. The workings run through roughly 16 miles of the system. 16 miles of wall inspected, chosen, worked and stripped. In places the good crust is gone, and you can see where the surface was taken back to bare rock. They were not picking up whatever lay near the entrance. They were prospecting, pushing further, because the nearer places had already been worked out by people who came before and told them where to go next. So what is it actually for? Start with gypsum, the most abundant. Gypsum is soft. You cannot make a tool from it. It holds no edge and carries no load. You cannot build with it. It is not food and it is not fuel. Crushed up, it makes a fine white powder. And that is essentially the entire practical potential of the substance to a person living in Kentucky 3,000 years ago. A very good white. White pigment is a real answer, and archaeologists take it seriously. But hold it against the price. You are proposing that people walked miles into absolute darkness, staged fuel depots along the route, and worked under loose rock in the dark to obtain the color white. There is white clay on the surface. There are white minerals in the riverbeds. Nobody needs a torch to find those. The explanation works. The arithmetic does not. So look at the others, because the others do something. Mirabilite and epsomite are not decorative. Taken into the body, both act powerfully as purgatives. Sodium sulfate and magnesium sulfate are still used medically for exactly that today. The taste is intensely salty and bitter, and nobody would mistake either for food. Anyone who put a fingertip of that on their tongue would have learned within hours precisely what it did, and never forgotten. And here's what haunts me about that. For 800 years, human beings walked miles into the deepest darkness available to them, rationing fire, past the places where people they knew had died, in order to scrape a medicine off a wall. Not gold, not food, not weapons, a substance whose main effect on a human body is to empty it out completely. That is what the expeditions were for. But it gets worse, because we cannot follow the material. These minerals are highly soluble. Take them out of that perfectly dry cave into ordinary air, ordinary damp, ordinary Kentucky weather, and they do not survive. They pull in water. They break down. They disappear. So in the villages, in the camps, in the burials on the surface, there is essentially nothing to find. The mine survives perfectly. The product does not survive at all. Compare that with what happened in the same cave much later. In the early 1800s it was mined again, for saltpeter, for gunpowder. Around 400,000 pounds came out. We know who owned the operation, who was forced to do the labour, where the material went, what it became, and exactly why. 2 centuries ago, and total clarity. The earlier operation ran 4 times as long, and we cannot say what a single handful of it was used for. Trade is the next answer, and it has some support. Residues of cave minerals have turned up in prehistoric containers found elsewhere, so the material did move between communities. Perhaps this valley supplied a whole region with medicine, entirely plausible, and still not enough, because a trade good is priced against the cost of obtaining it, and the cost here was absurd. There were easier things to trade. There were far safer ways to matter to your neighbours. Unless the cost was never a problem to be reduced. This is where careful archaeologists start choosing their words carefully, because there is another way to read all of it. What if the difficulty was not an obstacle to the value of the substance? What if the difficulty was the value? A medicine taken from the deepest reachable place in the known world, in the dark, at real risk, is not the same thing as one picked up in a field, even when it is chemically identical. Hold that, because we are going to need it. For now, just carry the shape of the problem. 800 years. 60 miles of workings. Real deaths in real places you can still stand beside, and a product we cannot trace, cannot find, and cannot explain. Something down there was worth all of it, and to understand how much, you have to understand what the journey to those walls actually did to a human body. Here is the thing to hold on to about the route. Nobody built it. Every underground place people usually picture was cut by human hands, sized for a human body. This was not. This cave was dissolved out of limestone by water over millions of years, entirely indifferent to whether a person would ever need to get through. The passages are not corridors. They are the shape water happened to leave behind, and you have to fold yourself into that shape. The beginning is generous, and that is part of the trap. The great trunk passages near the entrance are enormous. Wide, dry, flat-floored, ceilings high above your head. One chamber is roughly 1/4 of an acre. You could walk it with a torch and feel almost comfortable. The cave opens by being magnificent and easy, and it teaches you nothing at all about what it is going to ask of you later. Then it narrows, not gradually. The trunk ends, the root splits into smaller tubes, and the ceiling comes down. First you stoop, then you are bent at the waist with your torch held out at a bad angle. Then you are down, and that is the transition that matters. Because the moment your hands are on the floor, you are no longer a person walking through a cave. You are cargo, moving yourself. The crawl is the defining experience of that place. Palms and knees on cold, gritty, uneven rock. Your back scraping the ceiling. You cannot lift your head, so you cannot see ahead. Your light is being pushed in front of you or dragged beside you, and every so often you have to stop, brace, and swing it to keep it burning. Everything you carry goes ahead of you first, then you follow it. Progress is measured in body lengths. Then breakdown. In places, the ceiling collapsed sometime in the last few million years, and the floor is a chaos of limestone blocks, some the size of a room. There is no path over it. You climb. You choose holds by feel and by whatever your torch happens to be showing you, on rock that may or may not still be sitting where it settled. Somewhere in that cave a man died because a block he was working under moved. And the route does not stay level, it uses all 3 dimensions. Passages sit at different heights and connect through drops, climbs, and vertical shafts. We know how they handled that, because the equipment is still down there. Wooden climbing poles, cut and carried in, propped against the rock to reach ledges above. Somebody hauled a pole several miles through a crawl to get up a wall in the dark, and then left it for whoever came next. The floor is rarely dry. Mud, pools, water working somewhere underneath almost everywhere. Mud on limestone under a plant fibre sandal is close to frictionless. So you slow down. You test each foot before you commit, and you do all of it holding, in one hand, a burning bundle you cannot afford to drop into a puddle, because dropping it does not inconvenience you. It ends the trip, and possibly a great deal more. Now the temperature. The deep cave sits at about 54 degrees Fahrenheit, permanently, everywhere, in every season. That sounds pleasant, and for 20 minutes it is. Over 6 hours it is not. 54 is well below body temperature. The air is close to saturated with moisture, and you are moving slowly, often lying on cold rock. Visitors today are told to bring a jacket for a 2-hour walk. These people were in there in woven fiber for far longer, and it never let up. Sound behaves badly. Voices carry in ways that make no sense to a surface brain. Somebody 20 feet away in a low tube sounds like they are on top of you. Somebody in a large chamber sounds like nowhere. Water running under the floor seems to come from ahead or behind, or from the wall beside your ear. You cannot place anything by listening. One of your primary tools for knowing where you are simply stops working. Then the navigation problem, which is the worst of them. Passages branch constantly, and in a solution cave, junctions are not distinctive. They look like each other. Same limestone, same color, same shapes repeating, all of it seen inside a moving circle of firelight 15 feet wide. Every branch is a decision. Every decision compounds. No map, no marker system anyone can read, and no way to work out where you are from first principles. Only memory. And here's what catches people out even today. The route looks completely different on the way back. Coming home, you see the other face of every rock, the other side of every junction, the light falling the other way. A turning you memorized going in can be almost invisible coming out, which means the knowledge these people carried was not one route, it was two, the way there and the entirely separate way back. Time goes strange too. No light cue of any kind. No brightening, no dimming, no sun crossing anything. Your only clock is the torch, and the torch is not a clock, because it burns unevenly. Modern experiments have put people underground with no time cues and watched their sense of day and night come apart within weeks. Down there, on a long trip, hours would have stopped meaning very much at all. Which brings us to the arithmetic hanging over the whole thing. On the surface, a turned ankle is an annoyance. 3 miles inside that cave, it is a mathematical problem. You cannot walk. Much of the route cannot be carried through. Your group's remaining light was calculated for people moving at normal speed. Every hour you cost them is fuel nobody budgeted for. The cave does not have to be hostile to kill you. It only has to be exactly what it is. The obvious objection is that surely it was easier then. Surely the passages were bigger, or the route simpler, before modern collapse and modern debris. And here's what bothers me. It was worse. Those trails have since been widened, leveled and paved for visitors. Floors have been dug out to give clearance. What people walk through today is an improved version of what those people crawled through, and today it still takes lights and helmets. And we know the arithmetic was real, because we have the results of it. A man under a rock 2 miles in. A boy elsewhere in the system. These are not cautionary tales somebody invented. They are the physical consequences of the physical difficulty of passages that are still there, still that shape, still that cold. Which raises the question we have been circling from the start. Who exactly was making that journey? We keep saying they, ancient people, the miners. It is a convenient word, and it hides the thing that matters. Nobody has ever mined anything. Individuals did. Somebody woke on a particular morning, ate a particular breakfast, picked up a bundle of cane, and walked into a hill. And because that cave preserves almost everything it is given, we can say more about a few of them than about most people who lived 3,000 years ago, anywhere on Earth. Start with the obvious assumption. They were desperate, hard lives, hunger, no options, so they took the terrible job. It is the first thing everybody reaches for, and the evidence kills it immediately. The preserved remains let us reconstruct their diet in detail, and it is not the diet of people scraping by. Hickory nuts, sunflower, squash and gourd, goosefoot, maygrass, knotweed, wild foods alongside crops they were deliberately planting. And that matters more than it sounds. These were not people clinging to the edge of survival. They were early farming communities in one of the richest river valleys in North America, with stored food, planted fields, and enough surplus to spend weeks of labor on something that fed nobody at all. The cave work was not a last resort, it was discretionary. Somebody chose this when there were far easier ways to spend a season. Then there is a finding that narrows things sharply. Preserved human waste can be tested for hormone traces, which reveals the biological sex of the person who left it. One study examined 12 specimens from those passages. All 12 came back male. 12 is a small number, and nobody should push it further than it goes. But it is 12 out of 12, from a place where thousands of individual trips were made. And here's what that suggests. This was not the whole community going underground. It was a selected group. Some people went in, most people did not. Once you are looking at a restricted group performing a difficult, dangerous, seasonal activity with no obvious economic return, you are no longer looking at an industry. You are looking at something closer to a membership, something you are chosen for, something you are expected eventually to complete. One of the leading archaeologists of these caves has built that out properly. He argues the mining was part of a larger ritual performance, and specifically that these caves were where adolescent boys were taken in order to be made into men. Seclusion, secrecy, darkness, physical ordeal, a purging medicine taken from the walls, a white mineral carried back out as proof you had been. On that reading, the cave was never a mine. It was a threshold. Which brings us to the hardest part of this story. In 1875, 2 local cave explorers went into Upper Salt's Cave, into a section now called Mummy Valley, and came back out carrying a body. Not an adult, a child, preserved like the others by that dry, unchanging air. He had lain where he was left for something close to 2,000 years, entirely undisturbed until the moment they reached him. Analysis established the basics. He was male and around 9 years old. Later forensic work reconstructed what appears to have happened. He was working the cave minerals, he was badly hurt doing it, and he died underground from his injuries. A 9-year-old boy on a mining expedition deep inside a cave, which tells you something plainly. Children were not incidental to this. Children were part of it. But it is what happened next that stays with me. He was not left where he fell. Somebody moved him. He was carried to a ledge and laid out on it, deliberately, in a chosen place, which means that in absolute darkness, at the end of the worst day of their lives, with their own light already burning down, the people he was with stopped. They did not simply leave. They took the time to put him somewhere, and then they walked out. And here's the detail that finishes it for me. The researcher who studied him concluded that his burial appears to be the most recent prehistoric activity recorded in that cave. Read that slowly. Of everything that happened underground across all those centuries, the very last thing anybody did down there was lay down a child. And then nobody came back. Whatever the caves had been, that is where it stopped. What happened to him afterwards is its own quiet disgrace. He passed through private hands and became an attraction during the cave wars when rival owners were fighting for tourists. In the 1920s, a showman put him on display and invented a story to sell tickets, claiming he was a little girl, and gave him a girl's name that stuck for 100 years. A boy from an early farming culture in Kentucky, exhibited under a false name attached to a false death. The man under the rock got much the same treatment. After he was recovered in 1935, he was put in a glass case and left on a tour route. For roughly 40 years, visitors filed past him. He was a stop on the itinerary. People saw him on their holidays, somebody who had died at work, doing something we still cannot explain, spent 4 decades being looked at by strangers inside a cave he had walked into for reasons entirely his own. That ended, slowly and then properly. In the mid-1970s, federal law began prohibiting public display of Native American remains, and he was taken off exhibit. Then in 1990 came broader legislation establishing that human remains of any ancestry must at all times be treated with dignity and respect, and requiring consultation with descendant communities. The park now works directly with tribal partners on how these stories are told at all, and whether they should be. And so he was taken back, reburied close to where he was found, somewhere along the passage he had been working when the rock came down. The exact spot is not published. It is understood to be known to the park superintendent and to very few others, which means that today, if you walk that route, you pass him. You do not know where. That is exactly the point. He is back where he was, in the dark, undisturbed. So that is who we are talking about. Farmers with full storerooms, a restricted group who went in while everyone else stayed home, boys young enough to still be learning, a man in his 40s with a river shell hanging at his throat. Real people who chose this, repeatedly, for reasons they never wrote down, and who kept choosing it for 8 centuries. Which leaves only the question we have been circling: why? There are 3 serious answers, and we start with the one everybody reaches for first. So back to the answer we set aside at the beginning. It was a mine. They were taking minerals off the walls because those minerals were useful, and this was a business. I raised it early and knocked it down early, because the distance made no sense. But that was one objection, and it deserves better than that. So let us build the strongest possible version of it and see whether it holds. Theory 1. At full strength. It was medicine, and it worked. Not symbolic medicine, not ritual dressed up as medicine. Actual pharmacology. These communities located a genuinely effective set of compounds, understood what they did to a person, worked out where to obtain them reliably, and built an industry on supplying them. On this reading, there is no mystery down there at all. There is a supply chain, and we have simply lost the paperwork. And its greatest strength is that the chemistry is not in dispute. Sodium sulfate and magnesium sulfate really do act on the human body, powerfully and predictably. The effect varies with the amount taken, which means somebody paying close attention could learn to control it. That is a genuinely unusual property for anything available to a farming community in eastern North America 3,000 years ago. Unreliability is the great curse of early medicine. Most plant remedies vary enormously. Potency shifts with the season, the soil, the age of the plant, which part you use, how it was dried. 2 doses of the same herb are not really the same dose. Mineral salts do not have that problem. A crystal is a crystal. What you scraped off that wall last spring behaves exactly like what you scrape off this spring. In a world built on guesswork that is close to miraculous. And history backs them up. Sodium sulfate entered European pharmacy in the 1600s under the name Glauber's salt, from a chemist who called it the miraculous salt because of what it did, and it stayed a standard remedy into the 1900s. Magnesium sulfate sits in bathroom cupboards worldwide as Epsom salt and is still in genuine clinical use, not folk curiosities later debunked. Somebody in Kentucky found them thousands of years earlier. There is a purity argument stacked on top. These crystals grow in a sealed environment, no rain, no soil, no animals, no rot, no dust from a village. What forms on that wall is about as clean and consistent as anything a person could have obtained anywhere in the ancient world. If you are looking for something to put into a human body, a mineral that has never once touched the outside world, is an extraordinarily good candidate. Then supply. The crust regrows, slowly but continuously, as long as the passage stays dry and moisture keeps working through the rock above, which means this is not a deposit that gets stripped and abandoned. It is renewable. Work a wall, leave it, come back a generation later, and there is more waiting. That fits the archaeology exactly. Seasonal visits, centuries of return, a resource you manage rather than exhaust. Now set that in its wider world, because this valley was not isolated. The period is the early woodland, and early woodland North America was crisscrossed by enormous exchange networks. Copper came down from the Great Lakes. Marine shell came up from the Gulf and the Atlantic. Mica traveled out of the southern Appalachians. Materials moved hundreds of miles, hand to hand, between communities that never met each other. So picture the position that puts this valley in. Everybody wants copper, and only the north has copper. Everybody wants seashell, and only the coast has seashell. And if you happen to live on top of the one place producing a clean, reliable, genuinely effective medicine, you are not a backwater on the edge of somebody else's map. You are a supplier. You hold something the whole network wants and cannot get elsewhere. There is even physical support. Residues of cave minerals have been recovered from prehistoric containers found away from the caves. Not much, but exactly the right kind of evidence. It suggests the material really was gathered, packed, and moved somewhere, which means a regional medicine trade running out of a handful of Kentucky hills into a continental exchange system is not pure speculation. And the timing fits almost too neatly. Systematic mining begins around 1000 BC. That is essentially the moment the early woodland world begins its great expansion. Mound building starts, exchange networks intensify, communities settle, specialize, and start wanting things they cannot make themselves. The cave industry is not some isolated local eccentricity. It appears precisely when everything around it is becoming more connected and hungrier for goods. So that is the case, and it is a good one. A real drug, reliably sourced, renewably supplied, moving through a continental network, in a period built for exactly that. Coherent, grounded, no mysticism required. If you wanted a sensible, unromantic explanation for 8 centuries of underground labor, this is it, and plenty of serious people find it sufficient. But we are back at the same hole, and now it is bigger. Because the crust does not only grow 12 miles in, it grows in the first mile. Same substance, same wall, same chemistry, in passages you could reach and leave inside an afternoon. If this is a business, every mile past the nearest working face is pure loss. Wasted fuel, wasted time, wasted lives. And a business does not do that once, let alone seasonally, for 800 years. And here's what really bothers me. A trade operation wants volume, speed, and safety. This had none of the three. It sent small parties on long journeys into the most dangerous accessible place in their world, taking children to collect a substance that dissolves in a rainstorm. You can explain what they were taking using chemistry alone. You cannot explain where they went to take it, or why nobody ever settled for the easy material near the door. Which is the crack the second theory prizes open. If the difficulty makes no economic sense, then perhaps the difficulty was never economic. Perhaps going deep was not a cost of the practice. Perhaps going deep was the practice. And to follow that properly, we have to leave the chemistry behind and go listen to what people across this continent have said for a very long time about what lies beneath the ground. Theory 2 begins where Theory 1 broke. If the distance makes no economic sense, stop treating it as a cost. Start treating it as the point. On this reading, the cave was never a source of supply. It was a destination. The mineral was real, and they did carry it out. But the journey was not the price you paid for the mineral. The journey was the thing, and the mineral was what you brought back to show you had made it. To take that seriously, we have to move from archaeology into something else. And I want to be careful here. What follows concerns the traditions of living peoples. They belong to those communities, not to me, and I am only describing what those communities have themselves chosen to make public. But the broad shape matters enormously for what is underground in Kentucky, so it is worth setting out plainly. Cherokee tradition describes a universe of 3 levels. There is the upper world, associated with fire, with order, with what is settled and predictable. There is this world, the surface, where human beings live, and where the work of keeping balance is done. And there is the underworld, associated with water, with change, with what is not yet fixed. It is not a place of punishment. That idea was imported much later. It is a place of power. 3 levels means 2 boundaries, and a boundary implies a crossing. Spiritual power in that understanding is not confined to the sky. It is present in the landscape itself, in rivers, in mountains, in caves, which quietly transforms what a cave mouth is. On the surface, it is a hole in a hillside, a geological accident. Within that framework, it is a place where one level of the universe opens onto another, and where a person could, in principle, walk across. And there are traditions that make the connection completely explicit. The Choctaw people hold Nani-Waya, in what is now Mississippi, as their place of origin. It is a mound, and beside it there is a cave. The account, as the Choctaw Nation itself tells it, is that people were made underground and came up out of that opening into the daylight, group after group, and went out to become the peoples of the southeast. The sequence matters in the telling. The Creek came out first and travelled east. The Cherokee followed and went north, then the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw came out last, dried themselves in the sun on the slope of the mound, and chose to stay at the place where they had been made. It is a story about an entire region of related peoples sharing one birthplace between them, and that birthplace is an opening in the ground. And here's what that does to the direction of everything. In the tradition many of us grew up inside, human beings arrive from somewhere else, or are placed here from above. This is the reverse. You did not arrive, you came up. The earth is not the floor of the world, it is where you are from, and the opening you came through is not a metaphor, it is still there, it is still open, it is a place you could walk to. Versions of that idea appear right across the continent, in the southwest, on the plains, through the eastern woodlands. The specifics differ enormously, and the traditions belong to different peoples with entirely different histories, so nobody should flatten them into a single story. But the recurring shape is striking. Underneath is not empty. Underneath is where things come from. The ground you are standing on is a lid, not a foundation. Now the objection, and it is a serious one, because this is exactly where arguments like this go wrong. The people in the Kentucky caves lived 3,000 years ago. The traditions I have just described were recorded from living peoples within the last few centuries, in some cases hundreds of miles away. You cannot reach back and staple one onto the other. Nobody has demonstrated that line. Pretending otherwise is not respect, it is carelessness. So the theory needs something firmer than a family resemblance, and in a cave in northern Alabama, it has one. Manitou Cave contains inscriptions written on its walls in the Cherokee syllabary, the writing system developed nearby by Sequoyah in the 1820s. A team of Cherokee scholars working alongside archaeologists has read them. They are first-person accounts, left by Cherokee people, of what they were doing deep inside that cave. And what they were doing was ceremony. The inscriptions record ritual preparation and purification carried out in the cave's secluded underground water in the years immediately before the forced removals of the 1830s. Some of the writing on the ceiling runs backwards, as though addressed to readers inside the rock itself. Out of respect, the researchers deliberately did not publish translations of the most sensitive passages at the request of Cherokee community members. Think about what that establishes. Not a resemblance. Not an inference. A documented case of native people of the Southeast going deep into a cave to conduct sacred ceremony, and telling us so directly in a writing system they invented themselves. Whatever else is uncertain, the practice is real, it belongs to this region, and it survived into a period we have written records for. The only question left is how far back it runs. Apply that to Kentucky, and the arithmetic inverts completely. Every mile that made no economic sense suddenly makes perfect sense. If a cave is a boundary between worlds, then depth is not overhead. Depth is measurement. The further in you go, the further across you have gone. 3 miles is more than 1 mile. 12 miles is more than 3. You are not traveling to a resource. You are traveling into somewhere, and how far you got is the entire point. And everything else falls in behind it. The children fit, the seasonal timing fits, the restricted group fits, a single-sex party entering at fixed times of year, bringing younger members, enduring an ordeal in the dark and coming back out changed, is a strange way to run a mine. It is a completely ordinary way to run an initiation. Even the mineral changes character. It stops being a commodity and becomes a token. Proof of a crossing. And a token does not need to survive the journey home. It only needs to be carried out into the light. So Theory 2 answers what Theory 1 could not. Why so deep? Why children? Why seasons? Why 8 centuries with no economic logic anywhere in it? It is elegant, and serious scholarship stands behind it. But it leaves the largest question in this story completely untouched. Because if this was sacred, if this was part of who these people were, then something must have happened to stop it. And whatever it was, it did not interrupt the practice, it ended it. Theory 3 needs a warning label first, because there is a popular version we are not going to spend time on. You will have heard the idea that somewhere beneath North America there is a hidden civilization, a lost race, a secret people living underground. It is an old story, told in a lot of places, and there is no evidence for it whatsoever. It also has an ugly history, because it has often been used to suggest that Native Americans were not the ones who built what is actually there. So set that aside. The real third theory is not about hidden people beneath the earth, it is about hidden people among the living. It says the point was not the mineral and not the crossing, but the secret. That an exclusive group held knowledge nobody else could obtain or verify, and that holding it was itself the source of their standing. On this reading, the cave was not a mine or a temple. It was a machine for producing insiders. To see why that would matter, look at what was happening on the surface at exactly the same moment. Something genuinely new was underway in those river valleys. Eastern North America is one of only a handful of places on Earth where agriculture was invented independently, from scratch, by people who had no idea that anyone anywhere else was doing the same thing. They domesticated their own crops: goosefoot, sumpweed, sunflower, squash, maygrass, erect knotweed, an entire agricultural system built out of local plants, none of it borrowed from Mexico, developed over thousands of years. By around 3,000 years ago, food-producing economies were securely established across the region. The people in those caves were not simply farmers. They were the descendants of people who had worked farming out themselves, in place. And farming does something to a society that hunting does not. It creates permanence. Plant a field, and you have to come back to it. Store a harvest, and you have something that can be taken. Clear ground and improve it. And now somebody has a claim on that ground, and somebody else does not. For the first time, there are things that belong to people. And where there is belonging, There has to be a rule about who belongs. That is a genuinely hard problem, and it is easy to underestimate. A small mobile band does not need one. Everybody knows everybody. Kinship handles it. But a settled community with fields, stores, and things worth inheriting suddenly has to answer questions nobody had to ask before. Who is one of us? Who decides? Who inherits? Who gets a say? And there is no writing, no law, no court, and nobody to appeal to. This is where the published argument gets very interesting. The same archaeologist who proposed the initiation reading takes it further, using an economic framework. He suggests early woodland ritual cave use is bound up with the formation of new social institutions and new kinds of property relations, arising directly out of the shift to farming. In plain terms, the caves appear at the exact moment communities needed a way to define membership, and they may have been that way. Consider how well a cave solves it. You need a credential that cannot be faked, something proving a person is genuinely one of you. Now think about what a 12-mile journey into total darkness produces. Knowledge of a route nobody outside the group possesses. Shared experience of an ordeal nobody outside the group has undergone. And a physical object, carried up into the light, that could only have come from somewhere almost nobody has ever been. And here's the engineering of it. It is unfakeable. You cannot pretend to have made the journey. There is no manual to steal, no map to copy, no shortcut to buy. The knowledge exists only inside the heads of people who have already done it, and it can only be transmitted by them, in person, by taking you along. Membership is not a claim you make about yourself. It is something existing members physically walk you into. That also explains what the other theories struggle with. Why go further over time? Because a credential inflates. If everyone in your generation has reached the first working face, then reaching the first working face proves nothing. The value lies in scarcity, so the boundary moves. Each cohort has to go past the last one, further into the dark, until eventually somebody is 12 miles inside a hill, scraping a wall nobody has ever reached. And it makes sense of the 12 out of 12. If the cave produces membership, then whoever is excluded from the cave is excluded from something much larger than a mining trip. Most of that community never went. Half of it may never have been eligible. This reading is less romantic than the others and considerably less comfortable because it describes those caves not as a wonder but as a boundary, a mechanism for deciding who counts. And that is not a slur on these people. It is what human societies do, everywhere, always, whenever they get big enough to need it. Guilds, degrees, regiments, priesthoods, professional bodies, every one of them works the same way. A difficult, shared, verifiable experience outsiders have not had, controlling access to something valuable. The only unusual thing here is the setting, and the fact that the entrance requirement could kill you. So which of the three is right? Possibly all of them at once. That is the least satisfying answer and the most likely one. Real medicine, gathered inside a genuine cosmology, by a group whose exclusive access to both gave them standing on the surface. Human institutions are almost never one thing. A cathedral is architecture and faith and politics and economics in the same building, and nobody inside it is separating them out as they go. And underneath all three, the same physical facts sit unchanged. Somebody memorized a route. Somebody stacked cane against a wall for a trip that never happened. Somebody drew a spiral in soot, miles from daylight, and walked on. Somebody carried a boy to a ledge in the dark and set him down carefully, and then climbed out. Whichever framework you prefer, those things were done by people, for reasons that mattered to them. But all three now run into the same wall, and it is the wall this whole thing has been heading towards from the first minute. Because every one of them explains why people went down. Not one of them explains why they stopped. An industry does not vanish. A religion does not switch off. An institution does not dissolve overnight, and yet somewhere around 200 BC, that is exactly what happened. Around 200 BC, the Kentucky cave work stops. We will come to why, because it is the last thing this story has left to give us. But something needs saying first, or the ending sounds wrong. The mining stopped. The underground did not stop mattering. Not in that region, not on that continent, not for the 2,000 years that followed. What ended in those caves was a practice, not an idea. What happens next in the wider region is one of the great flowerings of ancient North America. Right around that same moment, communities in the Ohio Valley start building earthen enclosures on a scale with no parallel anywhere in the archaeological record for societies of that size. Enormous squares, circles and octagons, precise geometry, alignments to the cycles of the sun and to the far harder cycles of the moon. And the materials came from the ends of their known world: copper from the upper Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, shell from the Gulf, obsidian carried all the way from the Rocky Mountains. These were not cities, no palaces, no kings, no writing. They were dispersed farming and foraging communities who nonetheless coordinated labor across generations to build ceremonial landscapes covering hundreds of hectares. And notice the form it took: mounds. They stopped going down into the earth and started building the earth upward. Same substance, opposite gesture. Rather than traveling into a hill to reach the world below, you raise a hill on the surface and place your dead inside it. Whether the two are directly connected, nobody can prove, but it is a remarkable thing to begin at precisely the moment the descending ends. Meanwhile, the caves themselves did not fall silent. And here's the part that genuinely embarrassed the discipline. For most of the 20th century, the accepted position was that native peoples of the southeast used caves near the entrances for shelter and burial, and that was the whole story. Nobody expected anything in the deep dark. Nobody looked. And because nobody looked, nobody found anything, which everybody took as confirmation. Then in 1979, a caver squeezing through a narrow passage in southeastern Tennessee noticed something on the mud banks lining the walls. Scratches, lines. He reported it to an archaeologist, who went and looked, and understood what he was standing in front of. Drawings, deliberate, ancient drawings, traced by fingertip into soft mud, in the dark zone of a North American cave. Nothing like it had ever been recorded on the continent. They named the site Mudglyph Cave. The images included animals, winged human figures, warriors, and a whole vocabulary of symbols already familiar from engraved shell and hammered copper at Mississippian sites across the southeast. Charcoal from the cane torches the artists burned dated the work to around 1300 AD. Not an isolated oddity, a known religion being practiced somewhere nobody had thought to check. So they started checking. As recently as the late 1990s, there were 7 recorded dark zone cave art sites in the entire southeast. 7. The catalogue today runs past 90 across Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia, with further sites in Arkansas, Missouri, and Wisconsin. In the first half of 2021 alone, 4 new caves were found. The number is still climbing, and it is not one style or one moment. 3 distinct techniques: mud glyphs, traced into soft surfaces, petroglyphs cut into limestone, pictographs painted in charcoal. None is clearly earlier than the others, and the dates run from around 6,500 years ago, deep in the archaic, all the way through to the historic period immediately before the forced removals of the 1830s. Put that together, and the scale lands. A continuous tradition of art made in absolute darkness, across at least 6 modern states, spanning 6,000 years, produced by the ancestors of the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, Seminole, Yuchi, and others. For comparison, the famous painted caves of Europe number around 350 known sites, and until 1979, nobody outside those communities knew any of this existed. Then the research got more interesting still. A team examined 44 open-air art sites and 50 cave art sites across the Cumberland Plateau and asked one question: does the subject matter depend on where it is? It does, overwhelmingly. Imagery of the upper world, celestial figures, weather beings, the powers acting on human life from above, clusters at high, open, sunlit places, bluffs, ridges, exposed rock in full daylight. And the imagery of the lower world is in the caves, serpents, underworld creatures, figures caught halfway through transformation. And here's the detail that settles it. Serpents are strongly associated with the world below, and in that survey they are entirely absent from the open-air sites. Not scarce, absent. Somebody was making decisions about where each kind of being was permitted to appear, and those rules held for thousands of years. Which means the landscape itself was the diagram, the whole three-level universe, laid out across the real topography of the Appalachian uplands, with the heights standing for above, the caves standing for below, and human beings living in the layer between. You did not need to build a temple. The country was already the model. You only had to travel to the correct part of it and mark what belonged there. So go back to the question the popular version likes to ask: is there a lost underground civilization in North America? And the honest answer turns out to be stranger and far better than the myth. There was no hidden race. There was something real, enormous and sustained, made in the dark over 6,000 years by the ancestors of people who are alive today, and it went unrecognized not because anyone concealed it, but because nobody thought to look. Which changes how we read Kentucky. Those miners were not an isolated cult doing something inexplicable. They were an early chapter in a tradition that continued for thousands of years after them, across half a continent, in hundreds of caves, and ended only when it was violently interrupted. Their story does not close at 200 BC. It closes there only for them, which brings us to what it may actually have felt like to be one of them. Now I want to turn this whole thing over, because I think we have been reading it wrong the entire way through. Everything so far has been framed as an ordeal: cold, dark, dangerous, exhausting, occasionally fatal. And all of that is true from where we are standing, but we are standing outside it. We are people who have never gone down, describing a place from the entrance. The people who actually went may have experienced almost none of it. Start with what the surface was really like. Their world above ground was not stable. Winter arrived and did not care about your stores. Summer came in hot and humid and full of insects. Crops failed. Rivers flooded, then dried. Storms came without warning. Animals were dangerous. Strangers were unpredictable. And every single thing that mattered to their survival depended on weather they could not control or forecast. Now go underground. The deep cave sits at about 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Not usually, not on average. Always. In January and in August, in a drought year and a flood year, in your grandfather's lifetime and your grandchild's. No wind, no rain, no sun, no season. Nothing changes at all. In a world governed entirely by weather, they had access to the only place they knew of that had none. And we are not the first to notice how unusual that is. In 1938, a physiologist from the University of Chicago and his graduate student moved into this very cave to run a sleep experiment, precisely because its conditions never varied. They lived underground for 32 days, trying to force their bodies onto a 28-hour day, taking their temperatures every 2 hours. Modern sleep science genuinely begins, in part, down there. Which is a lovely thing to consider, if you are listening to this in the dark. The scientific study of sleep partly started in a Kentucky cave, in a chamber not far from the entrance, because two men needed somewhere on Earth where day and night did not exist. The younger of the two adapted to the new rhythm. The older one never quite did. His body kept insisting on the sun it could not see. So hold that against 3,000 years earlier. To us the cave is disorienting because we have no reference points in it. To them, it was not disorienting at all. They had the reference points. They knew where the ceiling dropped and where the floor turned wet. They had walked those passages since they were small. What we experience as a labyrinth, they experienced as a road. And a road, you know well, is not frightening in the dark. That is the correction, and it applies to almost everything we have described. Darkness is only terrifying when you do not know what is in it. Move through your own house at night and you do not panic. You know where the doorway is. You reach for the handle without looking. Now extend that same familiarity across several miles of stone, taught to you by your parents, and the horror we have been describing simply drains out of the picture. And listen to what a cave does not contain. No wind, no rain on a roof, no animals in the brush, no footsteps you cannot place. No voices from a direction you were not watching. The sounds are water, breathing, your own party, and nothing else. On the surface, an unexplained noise means working out very quickly whether you are in danger. Down there are no unexplained noises. There is nothing there but you. And you were never there alone. That matters enormously. This was not solitary. Somebody carried the light. Somebody carried the food, somebody knew the next turning, somebody went first, somebody counted heads at the difficult places. Whatever else those hours were, they were hours spent with a small group of people who all depended completely on each other and all knew it. That is not a common feeling on the surface. It is not an unpleasant one either. So consider that this was not experienced as a bunker or a mine at all. Enclosed, unchanging, quiet, body temperature never far away, dark, warmish, held, and shared with people who had you. There is an older and better word for a space like that, and it is the one the Emergence traditions were already reaching for. Not a shelter you hide inside, a place you are formed in and come out of, which closes the circle. You go down as one thing. You spend hours or days in the dark, being something else. And then you climb back towards the surface and come out into the air, carrying something white in your hands. That is not a description of a mining shift. That is a description of a birth, performed deliberately by people who had almost certainly been told that the first people came up out of the ground. The obvious objection is that this is sentimental, that people died down there, and no amount of reframing changes it. Fair. And here's what answers it. The physical traces support the gentler reading, not the frightening one. Nobody panicking stops to draw a spiral on a wall. Nobody terrified stacks next season's cane neatly against a rock. Nobody in a state of dread carefully carries a child to a ledge and lays him down properly before leaving. Even the litter says it. Sandals dropped and left, bowls set down, shells used up and abandoned where they lay. That is the mess of ordinary working days, repeated so many times that nobody bothered tidying. It is not the debris of an emergency, it is the debris of routine, which is to say, of a place people were entirely used to being. And then, at the end of every one of those trips, the best moment. The long walk back, the passage widening, and somewhere ahead, so faint at first that you doubt it, the grey. Not light yet, just the dark becoming less complete. Then shapes, then colour returning to things, then the entrance, and warm air, and noise, and the sky, and everything living. After hours of holding a small circle of fire inside the earth, you step out into daylight, and it is enormous. They did that hundreds of times, thousands of times. Fathers and sons and cousins and neighbors, walking down into the quiet and coming back up into the world, season after season, for 800 years. Down and up, in and out of the ground, as reliably as breathing. And then, one year, somewhere around 200 BC, they walked out of that cave for the last time. Here is the fact, stripped of everything else. Somewhere around 200 BC, the people stopped going in. Not gradually. The radiocarbon dates cluster tightly, and the early woodland cluster ends. Nobody moved to a different chamber. Nobody kept it up on a smaller scale in a quieter corner. The whole thing simply ceases, in both major caves, at roughly the same moment, after 800 unbroken years. And nothing replaces it down there. That is the strange part. The gypsum was still on the walls, the roots still worked, the cane still grew on the riverbank. Everything that made it possible remained exactly as it had been. No flood, no collapse, no earthquake sealing the passage. The cave was still perfectly available. People just stopped choosing to go in, and then kept not going in, for 2,000 years. Which brings us back to those caches. Bundles of fresh cane, stacked neatly along the route, ready for a trip that never happened. Somebody staged those, somebody carried them in with a plan, expecting to be back within days, and whoever that person was, they walked out of the cave that day and never came back, and neither did anybody else, and the bundles sat in the dark for 20 centuries. So what happened? 3 serious candidates, and, as with everything else in this story, no clean answer. The first is agriculture, because at almost exactly the same moment the caves fall silent, maize begins arriving in the eastern woodlands from the south. Corn. A crop that would eventually rewrite how everybody in that landscape lived, ate, worked and organized themselves. Corn is not simply another plant. It demands different fields, different labor, different timing, different storage. It rewards permanent settlement and heavier investment in one place. Over centuries it would push aside the older crop system these people had built themselves. Perhaps the seasonal window in which people had always gone underground, in late spring and late autumn, was quietly taken over by a crop that needed them elsewhere. Except the timing does not quite fit, and honesty matters more here than a tidy ending. Maize arrives around then, but it does not become the dominant staple for another 1,000 years, so it cannot be the whole answer. It is a change beginning at the right moment, working far too slowly to switch anything off overnight. The second candidate is the thing we looked at earlier. Right as the caves go quiet, the Ohio Valley erupts into monument building on an extraordinary scale. Geometric earthworks, precise squares and circles and octagons, alignments to the sun and to the long cycles of the moon, ceremonial centers pulling people and materials from the Rockies to the Gulf, something enormous being built above ground at exactly the moment something ended below it. And institutions do compete. If the meaning of your world can now be gathered at a great public earthwork, in daylight, with hundreds of people present, in a structure aligned to the sky itself, then a secret journey, made by a handful of men into a hole in a hill, starts to look like the old way of doing things. Not wrong, just superseded. The new thing was bigger, more visible, and open to far more people. The third possibility is the simplest and the bleakest. It just ended. Not for a reason we could name, not corn or earthworks or anything you could point at. Because knowledge like that is far more fragile than it looks, and it only takes one generation to lose it forever. Think about how that knowledge was actually held. No maps, no writing, no survey. 19 miles of 3-dimensional labyrinth existing only inside the heads of people who had walked it, transmitted by taking somebody with you and showing them. That system is superb while it runs. It is also completely undefended. One bad season, one illness, one conflict, one cohort that did not go, for whatever reason seemed sensible at the time. And after that, it is gone, not forgotten slowly, the way a language fades, gone, in a single step, because the moment the last person who knew the route dies, the route ceases to exist as a human thing. The passages are still there, everything is still there, but nobody alive can find the way, nobody can reconstruct it, and there is nothing to consult. The knowledge does not decay. A switch is off. And here's the detail I have thought about more than any other part of this. The researcher who examined that 9-year-old boy from Salt's Cave concluded that his burial appears to be the last prehistoric activity recorded in that cave. Now, one cave is not the whole system, and a single event cannot end 8 centuries of practice across a region. That would be too neat, and it is almost certainly wrong. But it is very hard not to sit with the picture anyway. A working party goes down. Something goes badly wrong. A child is hurt and dies, and the people with him carry him carefully to a ledge and lay him out properly and climb back to the surface. And then, whatever they said to each other afterwards, in that cave nobody ever went down again. Cause or coincidence, we will never know, but that is genuinely where the record stops. And the silence afterwards is total. No account survives anywhere. No tradition we can identify records that this happened. 2,000 years pass. Whole nations rise and fall in the valleys above. The Hopewell world flourishes and ends. The Mississippian world comes and goes. Europeans arrive, take the land, and force the descendants of these people out of it entirely. And underneath all of it, the cave sits at 54 degrees, holding everything exactly as it was left. So what is this story actually about? Not a lost civilization, not a hidden race. Something much better than either. Ordinary people, farmers with full storerooms and children and neighbors, who for 800 years chose to walk into the most difficult place they knew, for reasons that mattered enormously to them and which they never wrote down. They were not primitive, they were extraordinary, and they left the whole thing lying exactly where they set it down. So tonight, as you settle, hold on to that. Somewhere under a green hill in Kentucky there is a bundle of river cane, cut and dried and stacked against a wall by somebody's hands, waiting for a morning that never came. Nobody has disturbed it, nothing there ever changes. The dark those people walked into was not a place of fear for them. It was familiar and quiet and shared, and every single time they came back up into the light. Sleep well, and thank you for coming down there with me.